Are you on the market to buy yourself a fast 50mm lens? In this video we'll try to determine which of these lenses produces the sharpest images, both wide open and at f2, the best value for money 50mm lens, the dreamiest bokeh, and then we'll also look at colour saturation, contrast, vignetting and everything else that goes in between. Let's take a look. Hello, welcome, Matt Osborne here from MrLeica.com. In this video we're going to be looking at fast 50mm lenses, and I have 11 lenses in total plus an extra 2 to quickly show you. The used price of these lenses ranges from around £30 to around £5,000, so it'll be interesting to see how these lenses compare. Let me first introduce you to each lens. So first, starting from the left, we've got the Voigtlander Nocturne 58mm 1.4. This is an SLR lens in Nikon F mount. Next we have the Leica Noctilux 50mm f 1.0 version 2. This is the fastest lens in the test, and it is a Leica M mount lens. The third lens we have is the Leica Summilux M Leica M mount lens, and this is the spherical modern lens. Okay, next we have the Leica Summarit 50mm 1.5 or 5cm 1.5. This is called a Summarit, but it's the vintage Summarit, not the modern Summarit. And this lens is also like an M-mount rangefinder lens. Okay, next we've got the Voigtlander Nocturne 50mm 1.5 spherical version. Now this is a screw mount lens or LTM mount lens. Next, another popular lens, the Canon 50mm 1.4. This is also LTM or screw mount lens. First we have the Jupiter-8. This is a 50mm or 5cm 1.5 lens. And this is also like a screw mount or like a thread mount. Okay, next we've got the Ecarl Zeiss Sonar 50mm f 1.5 lens. Now this is a Contax RF mount lens, so it's slightly different. If you wait till the end of the video, I'll show you how to mount this lens onto your camera. The afterblaze in this lens are ridiculously nice, if you can see that. And now we have the Nikkor or Nippon Nikkor SC 5cm or 50mm f 1.4 lens. This is another nice lens, and this is also similar to the last design. This is Nikon Rangefinder Mount lens, so Nikon S mount it's called. Okay, so now the next two lenses are kind of wild cards. They're not 1.4 or 1.5 lenses, but I did want to test them to see how their performance was. So first we have a Helios 103, that says Helios 103 53mm 1.8 lens. The bokeh of this lens is quite nice, and it might be a lens that some of you may have overlooked in the past. This is also a Contax RF mount lens. And last but not least, but I wanted to set a really cheap lens against some of the more expensive Leica lenses. This is a Jupiter-8 5cm or 50mm f2. And again, this is Contax RF mount. So this is my wild card of the test. Can a £30 lens compete with lenses as much as £3,000 and £5,000? Stay tuned and we'll see what this little lens can do. Now before we go any further, there's two lenses which are not included in this test. Number one is the Nikkor 5cm 1.2 lens. This is a Nikon F mount lens, and it should have been included in the test, but this tab here stops this lens mounting to the adapter, meaning I couldn't mount this to my Leica SL, so I wasn't able to test it. And lastly, for all you Minolta fans, I also have the Minolta MD Rocco 50mm 1.4 lens. Now I should have included this lens in this test being a 1.4, but I completely overlooked the fact that I own this lens. It was at the back of a cupboard and I forgot that I had it. So if you want me to do a video on the Rocco lenses, maybe let me know in the comments and I'll try and do that in a later video. My test rig for this test was the Leica SL digital camera, which is a full frame camera. And then I used the 7 Artisans L mount to Leica M mount close focus adapter. And then I mounted various adapters to the M mount to be able to mount all the lenses in the test. And before we jump into Lightroom, for each of these lenses I shot them wide open and stopped down by one stop, normally to f2, because if I'm looking to shoot a lens at f2.8 or f4 or f5.6, I won't use a fast 50mm lens, I'll use a slower 50mm lens, which are smaller and generally cheaper. See my previous 50mm lens video if you're looking for slower lenses. This is more about the fast 50mm lenses and using lenses at or close to wide open. This video will try to determine the sharpest fast 50mm lens, the lens with the nicest bokeh, the best LTM mount 50mm lens, and then we'll also look at colour saturation, contrast, vignetting and everything else that goes in between. So for each lens tested, I shot the lens wide open and stopped down one stop, meaning for most lenses there are two photos, so two for the Nikkor, two for the Zeiss, two for the Helios and so on. The only exception is the Noctilux, because the Noctilux is an f1 lens. I shot it at f1, f1.2, f1.4 and f2. Before we do any comparisons, we'll look at each lens wide open and stop down to see how the bokeh and the sharpness changes as you stop the lens down one stop. So first, the Nikkor SC 51.4. As you can see, wide open, the bokeh is quite prominent, quite heavy vignetting, but it's also not particularly sharp. It looks like at a distance, where at f2 it looks like there's a lot more clarity and the bokeh's kind of calmed down a little bit. If we zoom in to see the absolute sharpness, now I do remember when I did this test I misfocused on this one, so I do apologise, but you can see the sharpness is pretty amazing. So as you can see, wide open is sharp, and with some editing in Photoshop you could bring out this sharpness even more. So I'd say the Nikkor SC 51.4 is sharp enough to use wide open, and it only gets sharper and higher contrast as you stop the lens down one stop. Next we've got the Ecarl Zeiss 51.5. This is the Contax RF mount lens. Again, quite a lot of bokeh detail, wide open, and again it calms down, stopping it down to f2. I think at f2 it's got more 3D pop than wide open and slightly less vignetting, but still vignetting obviously at f2. If we zoom in, still reasonably good sharpness, wide open, and again you can bring that out in Photoshop, but the sharpness really jumps up quite a lot when you stop it down to f2. So like the Nikkor, these lenses are particularly good to stop down one stop. So this is the Helios 53 1.8 cheap lens from eBay, Contax RF mount. Now you can see this is a lower contrast lens, wide open compared to the last two photos, but it still gives you nice bokeh. Again, it's improved just by stopping it down to f2.8 in this case, because there's no f2 setting on the lens. If I zoom in, now this is why I've included this lens. This lens is sharp, wide open at 1.8. It just looks softer because of the lower contrast. If you use this lens as a lens hood, you'll improve the contrast, and then it will be quite a strong performer. And at f2.8, again, it's slightly misfocused, so apologies for that. I was trying to take care to get every shot in focus, but it seems this one has misfocused. Now this lens shouldn't be in the test because it's an f2 lens. The Contax RF mount Jupiter-8 P model, which is the one with the red P, or N, it's kind of the Russian writing. Okay, nice bokeh, nice colour, and a reasonably good 3D pop, perhaps compared to some of the other lenses, although the 3D look does improve when you stop the lens down to f2. The sharpness is quite good here, but it's perhaps not as sharp as these Nikkor or the Ecarl Zeiss or the Helios. Obviously once it's stopped down, the sharpness improves dramatically, so for the money this is a really good lens. Okay, next, this is a very popular lens. Now this in theory should be one of the best performers in the test. This is the Voigtlander Nocturne 58 1.4, on the left at 1.4, on the right at f2. You can see the bokeh doesn't change too much, but remember this is a 58mm lens, so it's a longer lens, meaning you're going to get a greater shallow depth of field. Really nice 3D pop, great contrast, great colours, pleasing shallow depth of field and bokeh. Vignetting I find quite pleasing to the eye, wide open, and there's not a huge improvement when you stop the lens down to f2 in terms of the overall look of the image. If we zoom in, this lens is sharp, so this is why this lens is so popular. So the Voigtlander is the sharpest so far, wide open at 1.4, and it's also the sharpest so far I think at f2. With really good contrast. You can see the increase in detail here looking at these lines and the writing here. Okay, next, another popular lens. This is the Canon 51.4 LTM, 1.4 on the left and at f2 on the right. As with other lenses, I think the 3D pop improves as you stop the lens down to f2, probably with the increased contrast. Again, nice colours, similar heavy bokeh, wide open, very slightly less, stop down one stop. If we zoom in, the sharpness is okay, wide open, and it's okay at f2. It's kind of usually sharp, but I think it's not the sharpest in this test. So that's the Canon 51.4. Okay, next up, this is the Voigtlander 50mm 1.5 LTM a spherical version. See more detail on this in the recent Voigtlander 51.5 video where I compare this to the new version of the lens. Now this lens again gives really good image quality wide open with, I'd say, 3D pop and good contrast at 1.5. Probably helped because it's an spherical lens and not a huge difference stop down one stop in terms of the overall look of the image. The bokeh will become rounder at f2 and it's more cat eye looking at 1.5, similar to some of the other lenses we've just looked at. If we zoom in, sharpness is pretty good, wide open, but it improves a lot by f2. So unlike the Canon, the Voigtlander really jumps up a gear at f2 in terms of sharpness, where the Canon was more of a subtle improvement. Okay, next this is a vintage lens. This is the Jupiter-8 51.5 LTM lens. Now you can see the reduced contrast in these images compared to some of the previous lenses we looked at. Again, slightly cat-eye bokeh wide open, where slightly rounder stop down to f2, although the contrast still doesn't improve at f2. If we zoom in for sharpness, now that's interesting, that's one of the few lenses where stopping it down one stop doesn't give a huge improvement to the overall sharpness. I think it is a slight improvement in sharpness, but it's still very, very soft compared to some of the ones we've just looked at. The sharpness has improved slightly, but it is very subtle. So that's the Jupiter-8. Okay, next this is the Leica Summarit 51.5. This is the vintage Summarit. So again, lower contrast, wide open, but improved stop down to f2. The bokeh's got quite a lot of character wide open, whereas stop down to f2 it tends to get again slightly rounder. Much better 3D pop at f2, stopping the lens down because of the increased contrast. If we zoom in for sharpness, this is a soft lens wide open in this example at 1.5, but at f2 the sharpness does improve slightly, although again not one of the sharpest lenses in this test. So next we have the Noctilux. This is on the left we've got the Noctilux f1, on the right we've got the Noctilux at f1.2. You can see a very dreamy looking image with a slight greeny blue colour cast. I'd say this lens seems to have the most colour cast of all the lenses we've looked at. If we zoom in for sharpness, it's not particularly sharp wide open in this test. You can see this is the softest we've seen it, with almost no visible writing, but it does improve by 1.2. So bear in mind this is still more wide open than any lens we've looked at so far. So to now make it a fair test, on the left we've got the Noctilux 51.0 at 1.4, and on the right we've got it at f2. Now at f2 it's looking like it's one of the sharpest, highest contrast looking images that we've looked at so far, and at 1.4 it's probably on a par with some of the other lenses. If we just zoom it out to see how the details are looking, you can see it's really quite sharp at f2. And in terms of the bokeh becomes more standard and the vignetting has dropped off quite a lot by f2, and it still has a bit of a 3D pop, but it perhaps loses some of the dreaminess that you get from shooting it at f1, f1.2 or f1.4. And lastly we have the Leica Summilux 50mm 1.4 a spherical. Now if you saw the last 50mm test, the Summilux stop down to f2 didn't seem to be as good as I'd expect compared to other lenses. Here we can see it shot at 1.4, you can see the cat-eye bokeh at 1.4 and then round bokeh at f2. Slight vignetting, but look at the detail on the sharpness. Really good contrast and what looks to be really good sharpness both straight away at f1.4 and then also at f2 in this test. If we zoom in to see how sharp it really is. Okay, so this is the Summilux showing what it can really do. This is why you pay for this lens. For those of you that do pay for this lens, you can clearly see this is just absolutely smashed all the other fast lenses I think in this test. We'll have a quick look in a second to compare, but this is the most detail I think we've seen here, this is the most detail I think we've seen here, and it's also a higher contrast image compared to most of the other images. I think the contrast really makes it look even sharper than the actual resolution, and then by stopping it down to f2 it only improves it even further. So this may be still the king of the 50mm lenses. So what we'll do now is we'll compare this lens to some of the other lenses to see which is best in the test. So now the important bit in the comparisons. On the left we've got the Voigtlander 58 1.4, which I deem to be a very good fast 50mm lens. On the right we've got the Summilux at 51.4. Look at the improved sharpness and detail on the Summilux compared to the Voigtlander. Obviously there is a huge price difference between these two lenses, but I didn't expect the Summilux to beat the Voigtlander by such a big margin when shot wide open. The photo on the left obviously looks larger because it's a 58mm lens rather than a 50mm lens. And if we do a full comparison, I'd say colours are pretty similar, maybe slightly more saturation in the Voigtlander, but not a huge difference. So that's both lenses shot wide open. Now this is both lenses stopped down to f2. Voigtlander on the left, Summilux on the right. At first glance the images look reasonably similar, maybe slightly more sharpness here on the Leica photo. If we zoom in for confirmation, now the Voigtlander 58 is good at f2, but the Summilux 51.4 is outstanding at f2. That is really quite a lot of detail. Okay, so here's another comparison for Leica shooters. On the left you have the Noctilux 50mm f1 at 1.4, and on the right you've got the Summilux 51.4 shot to wide open. You can see there's a lot more sharpness on the Summilux, even viewing at a distance, and if we zoom in the Summilux just absolutely smashes the Noctilux if sharpness is the thing you enjoy the most. So that's the Noctilux at 1.4, the Summilux wide open. And now here's the Noctilux at f2 on the left and the Summilux also f2 on the right. And you can, the sharpness in the Summilux is just such a big difference. I'd say slightly more pinky image with the Summilux, slightly more greeny image with the Noctilux. Now for another comparison, if you use a Leica Thread Mount lenses and you're looking for the best Leica Thread Mount Fast 50, let's compare the Canon 51.4 on the left and the Voigtlander 51.5 on the right. You can see the Canon has lower contrast, so potentially better for black and white. The Voigtlander's got better contrast wide open. If we look at the sharpness, the Voigtlander to my eyes has got better sharpness, and by sharpness in this case I mean better resolution, better contrast, giving an overall better sharpness. There's more detail in these lines here and on this number. So this is wide open. If we now compare the Canon 51.4 at f2 on the left and the Voigtlander 51.5 at f2 on the right, the Canon does improve at f2, and I think the Voigtlander is still the better of the two lenses. And just to zoom out in terms of the bokeh and the colours, to me I think the Voigtlander wins, but obviously it's personal preference. Now what about the most interesting bokeh, or most characterful bokeh? To me the Contax RF mount lenses and the Nikkor S rangefinder mount lens have got some of the more interesting bokeh. On the left we've got the Nikkor SC 51.4 wide open, and on the right we've got the Zeiss 51.5 wide open. I think the Nikkor bokeh is more prominent, but the Zeiss looks sharper and slightly higher contrast potentially. If we zoom in for sharpness, so in terms of sharpness I think the Nikkor wins, but the Sonar may have slightly more contrast, making it look sharper here. I'm looking at the resolution in the lines on the lens here, and I think the Nikkor slightly beats the Zeiss at f1.4 and f1.5 respectively. If we look at these lenses stopped down, again this is where I messed up my focusing, but I think the sharpness is greatly improved on the Nikkor. You can see how detailed the writing is here, and the sharpness is also improved on the Zeiss. If we look at the overall image, there's still quite a lot of character in the bokeh, and for me I think the Nikkor SE 51.4 is one of the nicest in terms of the most character in the image from a fast 50mm lens. Now if you're looking for a low contrast fast 50mm lens, we could compare the Helios 53 1.8 on the left and the Summarit 51.5 on the right. The Summarit is like an M mount, the Helios is Contax RF mount. Both of these lenses give a dreamy low contrast look wide open, but if we zoom in I think the Helios is going to be sharper. Yeah, yes, the Helios is a great deal sharper than the Leica lens at an absolute fraction of the price as well. And again, for those of you that like your bokeh and your lower contrast, on the left we've got the Jupiter-8 wide open f2 On the right we've got the Summarit 51.5 stopped down to f2. To my eyes the Jupiter-8 is more interesting, but that's obviously a matter of taste, and it looks like it's sharper. If we zoom in, no, I apologise, okay, so because it's a low contrast image, the sharpness is good, wide open on the Jupiter-8. You can see there's more resolution in the lines here, and in this writing, the 941, than it is on the Summarit. It just looks less sharp because of the lower contrast. And this is slightly high contrast here, because as I say, the Summarit is stopped down and the Jupiter-8 is wide open. And just to finish for a bit of fun, if you want bokeh and you think you need a 50mm f1 lens, on the left we've got the Jupiter-8 at f2, and on the right we've got the Leica Noctilux 51.4 at f2. You can see the Noctilux has got better contrast, but there's more bokeh detail on the Jupiter-8. If we zoom in for sharpness, now at first glance the Noctilux looks sharper because of the high contrast, but again if you look at the resolution in these lines and in this writing here, I'd argue that potentially the Jupiter-8 at f2 has got better sharpness than the Noctilux. So I think the clear winner of the fast 50mm test is the Summilux 51.4. Here it is again, just to finish, on the left at 1.4, on the right to f2. Amazing detail at 1.4, and not a huge step up, potentially even reduced by f2. Looking at this again now, this lens didn't perform as well as expected in the previous 50mm test, but you can clearly see if you want to shoot a lens wide open, this is the lens to beat of those that I've tested in this test. Okay, so those are the test results. Which lens did you think performed the best, and which lens was your favourite? Now if you're inspired to use one of these lenses for your own camera, I'll split these lenses into different lens mounts. So first we've got Contax RF mount and Nikon RF mount, those four. The middle group are all Leica Thread Mount or LTM lenses or screw mount lenses. These are Leica M mount lenses, and then on the end we've got the Nikon F mount lens. The Nikon F mount lens is a SLR lens, and all the other lenses in this group are rangefinder mount lenses. The advantage of a SLR lens is you can focus much closer, whereas the lenses in this block will be between 0.7 meters and 1 meter close focus distance. So that is one advantage of an SLR lens. I guess it'd be more accurate to split it like this. If you want to use a Nikon S lens, the best way to do it would be to use a Nikon S mount rangefinder camera. If you want to use these three lenses, the cheapest way to do it would be to use a Contax RF mount camera, something like the F4, or you could even use the Bokeh R2C that I use. And again, for the Nikon, you could use the Bokeh R2S. For the middle lenses, you can use any screw mount camera. It could be Fed cameras, it could be Zorky cameras, it could be something like a Voigtlander Bokeh R, Canon P or Canon 7, or Leica 3 cameras. All of those cameras are Leica Thread Mount cameras, and there are quite a lot of screw mount cameras that will accept these lenses. Obviously for Leica M mount, if you're shooting film, you want to use Leica M mount cameras, and you can also use some of the Bokeh cameras. See my all Bokeh camera video to work out which of those cameras are Leica M mount and which cameras are Leica Screw Mount. And then finally for the Nikon lens, any Nikon SLR camera will work fine with this lens. If we're now talking about digital cameras or mirrorless cameras, as already mentioned, I use the Nikon to M39 adapter for the Nikon. I use the Leica M to Leica L adapter for mounting the Leica M mount lenses onto a Leica CL or a Leica SL. Obviously you don't need to get the Leica branded one, you can use the 7 Artisan one, or you can use something like Novaflex or even a third-party cheap Chinese adapter. If you're a Leica M shooter, for screw mount lenses you need the screw mount to M mount adapter, like so. And if you're a Fuji, Sony, Lumix, anything else, you basically need the screw mount adapter to your camera body. And finally, these are slightly more quirky. If you want to mount Contax RF mount lenses or Nikon RF mount lenses to a Leica, you can get something like this. I've done a video on this already. So this particular adapter is Nikon RF mount to Leica M mount adapter. So I can use all of those lenses on my Leica M3, for example. If you want the correct flange distance, you want to get Contax to Leica if you want to use the Contax RF ones. See that video for full information. Okay, and so to summarise the best lenses in this test, I think if you shoot with a film SLR camera, Nikon or Canon, get the Voigtlander Nocturne 58 1.4. If you want the ultimate sharpness and the best of this test, get the Summilux. If you want the ultimate bang for the buck, I'd look at getting a Jupiter-8 or perhaps the Helios 103 lens. These lenses are pretty amazing for how small and cheap they are. And lastly, perhaps for character, I like the Nikkor SC 50mm 1.4. To watch the next lens test, click here. And for full videos with sample images, check the playlist for the lens that you're looking for. As always, a big thank you to my patrons, and see you in the next video. Bye.